have Dr. John in the studio. Yeah, it's 11 minutes past 8. Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick.
Great to have you here again this morning. And Dr. John, I've got something that I've got to talk to you about. It was in the media during the week, and it wasn't just on one channel. It came out sort of all over the place. When the media saw this, they went a little bit crazy because there's a lot of people scratching their head. They're saying, how could you know how to pronounce this, an Ichthyosaurus thingy, how do you say it? Ichthyosaur, world's largest mammal. It's like a big whale, basically, sort of a whale. How could it possibly have been found, and possibly quite a number of them, way up high in the Swiss Alps? Interesting, that one, isn't it? How did he get up there?
That certainly is. I didn't see that, Mick, so you've given me something this morning that I hadn't spotted in the media.
Oh, it's on quite a few channels. I saw it all over the place, yeah.
Well, there you go. Ichthyosaurs are not an uncommon fossil, but certainly finding it up in the Swiss Alps is a little bit unusual.
It is.
But, I've actually seen ichthyosaur fossils at Kubapidi.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there they were in the middle of the South Australian desert.
Yeah, but that's not that far above sea level, is it?
Yeah, it's a little bit inland.
Yeah, well, quite a bit inland, yeah.
Yeah, oh, look, it just goes to show that you find all of these things everywhere, and because they were a marine creature, obviously that means that the Swiss Alps were once covered by sea, just like the desert in Kubapidi was covered by sea.
Now, last week you were talking about this, and we're talking about, the difference between maybe a whole lot of little floods and one giant flood, Noah's flood. And, of course, if there was a lot of little floods, potentially there could have been a flood big enough for one to get into the middle of Australia, because it's not so high above sea level. But when you're talking about one of these giant sea creatures, well, actually a lot of giant sea creatures at the top of the Swiss Alps, that's another story.
That really is another story. And because you find them in such diverse places, and we've talked about fossil whales being found up in the Andes Mountains too, So, look, it's just blind. Well, I won't say blinding. That's not a good expression. It's just obvious that the whole world has been covered by water. Now, the science doesn't believe that. It doesn't acknowledge that the whole world might have been covered by water, but the evidence is absolutely crystal clear. And there's only one real obvious explanation for it, and it comes from the Bible, and which tells us that at the time of Noah, the whole world was covered to a depth of at least 20 metres by water. And everything that was an air-breathing land mammal died, apart from the ones in Noah's Ark. Ichthyosaurs would not have been on the Ark because they were a marine creature. Yeah. But, of course, even marine creatures got trapped in sediment and so on during that flood. And at the end of the flood, the mountain ranges have been lifted up. So what was buried there during the time of the flood has been hoisted up in the mountains and has become a fossil. And as we've talked several times over the last few weeks, and particularly we're indebted to Dr. Ron Neller for pointing this out, that local floods, no matter how big they are, do not produce these layers of sediment, and they don't produce fossils. So it has to have been a very, very unusual global event that would do it. And the Bible talks about it. So why don't we believe it?
Yeah, absolutely. You're on 94.9 this morning with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Of course, Creation Ministries do have their own website, creation.com, with thousands of articles and all sorts of answers to all sorts of questions to do with creation and evolution. However, if you have any questions in regards to creation and evolution, or even anything that we're talking about this morning, please, international. And we've been talking about something that was in the news over the last week. It was in a lot of different, or on a lot of different news channels. They were talking about, these Ichthysauruses. I don't know how to pronounce them, Dr. John, but that's okay. They're giant ocean mammals that were found at the top of the Swiss Alps. And I've had conversations, Dr. John, with people about, this sort of thing, and they say, yeah, but, the reason why, we see things like the Hawkesbury River with all those layers is because, it's down low. That's where all these sort of sediment wash. But, most sediment would have been washed to the bottom of the ocean. That's sort of their theory. That's what people see as, sediment goes to the bottom of the ocean, and then that's why you get these giant plains of sediment. And I've seen a lot of videos as well where they show the bottom of the ocean with these giant caverns and crags and cliffs, and there isn't these giant lakes of sediment on the bottom of the ocean even. So, it's a little weird.
Yeah, it is, Mick, and you're quite right. There isn't a lot of sediment on the bottom of the ocean, and certainly you cannot explain sand getting washed into the ocean as the explanation for why you don't see any sedimentary rock layers these days. And it's true that some sediment does get washed into the rivers, but it's not a great deal. We do occasionally have to dredge out rivers that are used for navigation. And of course, for some of the biggest rivers in the world, some of that sediment does deposit at the mouth of the river, and forms what we call a delta. And let's face it, two of the biggest rivers in the world are the Nile and the Mississippi, and they've got deltas. But it's not huge. It certainly wouldn't account for all the sediment that might be so-called washed away into the ocean.
And all that movement in the ocean just keeps the sediment sort of, I guess, moving, and it must deposit in some places, but not in these great flat expanses that we see in areas around the world above sea level, where you can see those layers.
Yeah, and not only do you see layers everywhere right throughout the world, sometimes they're 1,000 metres or more thick. Now that's a lot of sediment. A kilometre of rock layers is a lot of sediment. So, the only explanation, the only reasonable explanation, is that it was a one-off event. And a global event, because when you go around the world, what you see is the similarity is just uncanny. Yep. And in some of my talks, I've produced photos of, say, the sedimentary rock layers along the coastline here. You drive south from Sydney to Wollongong, all the coastline is that sedimentary rock layer.
Yeah.
And if you go 4,000 kilometres away up in Kakadu and have a look at the Kakadu escarpment, looks exactly the same. So, even in Australia, you're getting the same appearance 4,000 kilometres away. So it's a bit of a local flood to have the same thing in Sydney and in Kakadu. So
absolutely, It was interesting how Dr. Ron was. He mentioned, some of these layers that the scientists or geologists have said, there's 1 million years, thick, this big layer. Well, they've found trees that have had their roots torn off them, but they're upright.
That's right.
Right through an entire layer. It's like, did that tree stay there for the whole 1 million years while it was slowly building up?
That's right. They call them polystrate fossils. And the other thing that you see between the layers is this dead flat surface. And no soil or vegetation or anything between the layers. Yeah. So how could they have been sitting there for 1 million years? No, not just 1 million, 10 million, 20 million, Yep. And that's sort of what is conventionally believed about the time frame of the different layers. It's just impossible. So there has to be another explanation apart from the world's conventional one. And it's pretty obvious, well, it's always been obvious to me since I became a Christian, that the Bible's explanation is the one that is true.
Yes. I find it interesting looking at some of those layers in the rock, because if you can imagine underneath an ocean that's, this world finally covered in water, there'd be, big layers of mud slipping over other big layers of mud that came from different places. Now, as a skier, I've actually done a course in in sort of reading avalanche areas and reading snowpacks, and so I understand the slip layers and what actually happens, and when a whole layer slips on top of another layer, how it leaves a really sort of even surface. And you can imagine that happening in mud. And it makes so much sense, the way these layers look, that it was probably a big wet layer slipping over another layer, as opposed to a million years of slow build-up leaving a perfectly flat surface. It sort of doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's right. And, of course, people are conditioned to think that Noah's flood was just caused by rain. I mean, everybody's heard the expression 40 days and 40 nights of rain. But it was an enormous... I mean, it was such a destructive event on the world. Nothing like it has ever been before or since. You know, God created the original world that obviously was covered with a lot of greenery, and it was destroyed. And Noah's flood was not just rain, as we've talked about many times. It was tectonic upheaval. Something probably fractured the Earth's crust. Whether it was fractured from without or within, I don't think we know. But something fractured the Earth's crust, and as it says, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. There would have been volcanic eruptions, earthquakes. I mean, it must have been a catastrophic time. And one of the greatest understatements I think the Bible has, when Noah and the animals were in the ark, it said the ark moved around on the face of the waters. I reckon it did. It moved around a lot on the face of the waters.
I'll bet it did too. You're on 94.9. It's 26 past 8. We've got the news and weather coming up shortly.
It's hard.
94.9, it's 24 minutes to 9. And we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. Been talking a bit about the flood this morning, about giant ocean mammals that have been found at the top of the Swiss Alps, and something else in the news over the last week, Dr. John. There was a story in Science Alert. It was also in a few other publications where they were talking about this record-breaking earthquake swarm that has hit Antarctica. They say as a sleeping volcano awakens. Now, apparently, there was 85,000 earthquakes in a reasonably short period of time. You might be saying, well, is that really just one big earthquake or a whole lot of little ones? But it was really sort of a long period. And that's sort of, only over the last couple of years. This is an earthquake that's sort of 900 metres above, or rather, a volcano that rises 900 metres above the sea floor down near the northwestern tip of Antarctica, near the South Shetland Islands. So I found it interesting. I mean, there's a lot going on down there, but does that have anything to do with the oceans warming?
I would have thought so, Mick. I mean, there are underwater volcanoes in the Antarctic, and they do erupt. And when you think about it, that'd probably do a little bit of warming of the water. And when you see all these photos of Antarctic ice shelves breaking off, and suppose the atmospheric warming from global warming, you think, well, maybe it's coming from underneath, or I think maybe it might be coming from underneath. And why would you postulate something that is unproven when you have something that is proven? And I mean, while we're on the subject of earthquakes and volcanoes, it sort of follows on from Noah's flood a bit, because, as we said, it wasn't just rain; it was something fractured the whole of the Earth crust, and we have all of the tectonic plates that are moving around now, and obviously places like the Pacific Ring of Fire, where that's where you get all the earthquake activity going all the way from South America up to North America and around the Pacific.
Yep.
So, and I actually did a talk a day or two ago on the Mount St Helens volcano, which is one of the volcanoes that sits right on that Pacific Rim of Fire. It's in North America, and it's part of the Cascade Mountains that runs from Canada down to California. So it's right on that Pacific Rim of Fire. And it actually, it's about the 42nd anniversary of that eruption, because it erupted in May 1980. And it's probably the most studied volcanic eruption in history, because it was expected. The mountain had been rumbling a bit, and because it was in America, all the cameras were there to capture it on film, you know. And just like happened here with the floods, people were warned that it was going to happen. A lot of people didn't heed the warning for sometimes good reasons. You know, they said, "Look, this is our home. We're going to take our chances. We're not going." You know, and quite a few people were killed in that volcanic eruption. Now, as I say, it was a well-studied eruption. It wasn't really on the same scale of Krakatoa, or certainly didn't cause the same human damage that Mount Vesuvius did when it erupted and buried Pompeii and Herculaneum back in the first century. Incidentally, Vesuvius is still there, and it sits right above Naples, and there's a lot of people who live in Naples. So, you know, if we do get a lot of increased volcanic activity in the earth, then there's a few places where a lot of people live that would be very, very dangerous. But anyway, that's beside the point. But yeah, Mount St Helens blew up in May 1980. And because it's been so well studied, a lot of the things on the aftermath of that eruption have been very, very instructive, because scientists have taken a great deal of notice of what happened. It actually blew the top off the mountain, blew about 500 metres off the top of the mountain.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it was a pretty sizable eruption, and lots of mud. A lot of what comes out of volcanoes is water, and a lot of mud flows and so on, and it completely transformed the landscape for miles around it. And there was a beautiful lake up there that they called Spirit Lake, and it, you know, just blew that to smithereens. You know, in fact, a lot of unstable lakes formed up there on the mountain from the eruption, and one of them gave way, and this great torrent cascaded down the mountain, and it carved a canyon that they call Little Grand Canyon, because it looks just like a miniature scale version of the real Grand Canyon. But the interesting thing, when it carved the canyon out, which it did in 24 hours, that's all, it didn't take long, they could then have a look at the side walls of the canyon. And lo and behold, the side walls were all this sedimentary strata, just like we see in other canyons around the world. So although that was formed volcanically, whereas others are probably formed underwater, the similarities are so great. You think, gee, you know, catastrophes are the sort of things that do that, produce those formations, rather than the over millions and billions of years, one layer on top of the other, you know, that sort of thing. So,
of course, in the Bible it does say that the water came up from the deeps, so there was a lot of breaking of the ground going on.
Oh, absolutely, and like we said earlier, Noah's flood was the greatest catastrophe that the world has ever seen. But when we see catastrophes on a smaller scale, we can see probably the mechanism by which Noah's flood has produced the geological structures that we see today.
Absolutely. You're on 94.9 at 16 minutes to 9, and we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. If you have any questions, send them to our text line, SMS over studio from Creation Ministries International talking to us this morning about all sorts of things to do with Noah's flood and giant ocean-going mammals found at the top of the Swiss Alps. And one last thing that was in the media, Dr. John, you might have seen it. It was big news. Apparently Australia and Asia, we went through a radio blackout last week. Apparently the solar storms have been immense. And in fact, they've been worse than what a lot of the guys that study the sun thought they would be this year round. And it hasn't stopped. These were just literally in the last week. We had radio blackouts here in Australia. And there's now people that are sort of jumping up and down saying, hey, we believe that, some of this solar storm activity is affecting our climate. I mean, it's great for watching things like the Northern Lights and the Southern Lights, whatever they're called, but there's other stuff going on as well, charged particles flying around the world.
Yeah, look, and we need to remember from a biblical perspective too, Mick, that the sun's got a finite lifespan. I'm not suggesting that these solar flares are about to cause the imminent breakup of the sun, but nevertheless, we do know, as Jesus said, that right at the time of the end, the sun won't give its light, and there will be signs in sun, moon, and stars, and things like that. So, I think it's exciting from a Christian point of view, and who knows what effect that's actually having on our climate. When the sun supposedly goes through these cycles of not too many solar flares and then a whole lot of solar flares and so on. But we don't know whether the cycles will be repeated, do we? We assume they will, but you just never know. And
over time, they've sort of seen this cycle, but it doesn't mean it'll happen again. But there's people now trying to join dots between solar flare activity and then we were talking about before the volcanic and tectonic plate activity, and they're trying to draw parallels there, and there's still a lot of unknowns where there's a lot of guessing.
Absolutely, and obviously the sun has a huge gravitational pull on the Earth. How much these solar flares, what difference they make, who knows? But look, I just wanted to come back to what we were talking about with Mount St Helens and the way some of the canyons, in the aftermath of the eruption, were carved rapidly through soft mud, so that you can actually see the layers of strata on the side of these canyons. But the other very, very interesting thing is that when you look down the bottom, there's a remaining little creek. And when you look down the bottom of a lot of the canyons that we didn't see form, things like Grand Canyon and so on, what do you see at the bottom is a little river. And it's always been assumed that the river was what gradually eroded the canyon. But when you look at the evidence for Mount St Helens, it looks more like maybe the river is a leftover of the torrent that did carve the canyon. You know, and so what Mount St Helens did was cause a lot of geologists to start rethinking, their geology. Did things really happen the way we formerly believed they happened, or is there something else like catastrophe that has been the cause of it?
Yeah.
So, it was a very, very instructive eruption.
Yes. Now, we did have a question come through this morning as well, Dr. John, in regards to, the movement of the ground. And the question was, what about the continental shelves? How do they fit into the whole geological, makeup of the world?
All right. Well, I think we'll have to take that on notice, Mick, because we haven't got time to do it. But what about the continental shelves? All right. Well, next time I'm on, we'll talk about that.
Yep.
But I'm not going to be on next week because we're going to have another creation speaker next week, a young fella called Scott Devlin, and you can have a chat with Scott next week, and I think you'll find what he's got to say is pretty exciting as well. So I'm really pleased the fact that we've incorporated a lot of the other speakers into this program, because it gives people a variety, and not only that, they've all got expertise in different areas. And as people listen to all of the other speakers, they'll be able to see that, there's a lot of evidence that goes against what is conventionally believed by science. And when you look at the evidence, not what is believed and not what was just opinion, when you actually look at the evidence, it is so consistent with what the Bible says. So Christians should be really encouraged, and I would recommend that all our listeners just listen in to what these other speakers have got to say, because they'll not only verify what I say, but they'll give a different perspective on it. So it should be really interesting.
I'm excited. That'll be next Tuesday morning, just after 8. Definitely tune on in. Well, thank you, Dr. John. Another awesome week. And, very interesting, isn't it? Looking at what's happening underneath the ground and up above our head. And this is news just from the last week.
That's right. And there's lots of things we don't know, Mick, and they all verify our Bible.
Absolutely. You're on 94.